Here we go. Kinesiology 230, chapter 3 still. We're in presentation number 6. We're talking Cori cycle, lactate threshold, onset blood lactate accumulation. OBLA is another way to think of that. So OBLA D, OBLA da. Let's get on with this. We talked last time about this process. Now, this process of going through fast glycolysis, and you have lactate that's created because remember, you have the byproduct or substrate that you have is pyruvate. Sorry, blanked out there. So the pyruvate has two different fates, one of which is if there's plenty of oxygen, the pyruvate can then go into the Krebs cycle. If it can't go into the Krebs cycle because there's not enough oxygen, then it becomes lactate. So the pyruvate gets converted, becomes lactate, and then the lactate enters the blood goes to the liver. You have this process where it goes in the liver and exchanges it for lactate becomes glucose to glycogen. Then you have blood glucose that's taken to the muscles, which is converted yet again, glucose to glycogen for fast glycolysis. Now what ends up happening is this whole process happens through gluconeogenesis, and we talked about that in the last presentation. And it's all about how the body is able to process lactate in the liver itself. Now, the Cori cycle that we're talking about here, it helps clear lactate and recycle it into glucose, and this prevents excess acidosis, right? So we talked about the acidicness that we have, or acidity that we have in the blood when we're working out. And that acidosis and the shift to the right in the pH level and the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, what you're trying to do is keep that from shifting to the right. And you want the blood to be more neutral when you're working out, or at least slow the process of shifting to the right. And so it's really kind of a key process, this whole Cori cycle, in being able to have prolonged high intensity activity at a very high energy expenditure and being able to provide the ATP needed to make this happen over and over and over again. Now you got to understand it doesn't happen in slow glycolysis. You know, the pyruvate has a different fate. It doesn't turn into lactate. It actually enters the Krebs cycle and it goes through the Krebs cycle and creates ATP with the use of oxygen. With fast glycolysis, it's a different story. So you have to think of the Cori cycle as like a bit of a recovery process that is linked to fast glycolysis and high intensity exercise. Perhaps you know somebody named Cori who's a really fast runner or explosive athlete, and that'll help you remember. All right, so with this, there's a lot going on in a little chart. And with our blood lactate concentrations, they normally hover right around 0.5 to 2.2 millimole per liter at rest. And that's this baseline number you have down here, represented down here. As we look at this, you have lactate production increases with increasing exercise intensity. They kind of run together. The peak blood lactate concentrations occur approximately 5 minutes after ceasing exercise. Now, this makes sense if you kind of think it through. We're working out, we're doing a hard track workout, we're running really hard. Our bodies are still, even though we're not doing the sprinting per se, our bodies still have to process all those byproducts. And as a result, it'll cause the lactic acid in our blood, the lactate concentrations in our blood to rise even after we're done with an activity. So the blood lactate concentrations return to pre-exercise levels within an hour or so after activity. And what you find is that active recuperation, which helps bring in the oxidative side of the equation and allow there to be greater respiration. There's more O2. We already know the O2 allows us to shift and have the pyruvate that's in the whole process of glycolysis go into the Krebs cycle, and we can create more ATP, and that helps us, and it helps to create a virtuous cycle of recuperation. So if we look through this and we kind of take another look at this, when we look at this inflection point, right, you have this baseline level, right, 0.5, 2.2, give or take. They denoted here, this little line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They denote it as a 1, right, and that's 1 millimole per liter in terms of blood lactate. As we start to perform exercise, you have this oxygen uptake. We could have 100% capability and 0. So if we're going from 0 to 100, over the course of working out, we have this progressive exercise intensity. We're increasing the workloads. We are at roughly 50% is where you have lactate threshold. It's the level at which the blood starts to accumulate lactate above the baseline. And what you start to see is there's this transition point that you have, and it becomes a reliance on the anaerobic system. What happens in this, and what I like about this little graph here, where it kind of sums everything up. Let me get myself out of the way there. 0.5 to 2.2. If I get myself out of the way, this whole process, when we look at it, we know this is our baseline. We know this is where we start off. We know that when we start to work out, when we reach a certain level, we're going to have or hit lactate threshold, and that's when we start to accumulate blood lactate. And we know lactate itself can be an inhibiting factor. It's actually, when we talked about before, lactic acid itself is not so much the limiting factor, but there is an acidic component in the blood where you have the hydrogen ions are causing it to happen. But let's just kind of go with what they're talking about in the graph here. And with the graph itself, they talk about this threshold at about 50%. And this 50% is the same for untrained and trained subjects. I would contest that when you have somebody who's a trained subject, this will push out a little bit further. They can tolerate, or it's almost like a relative term, like an RPE becomes like a relative component in terms of how hard they can work. But where I want to go with this is the threshold itself. Once we go past it, you start to have this accumulation, and this accumulation usually starts around 4 millimoles per liter. And when you look at training for athletics itself, when we get past this, you have this onset blood lactic, OBLA, onset blood lactate accumulation. Boy, for untrained individuals, which is a solid line, that's roughly like 65, 70%, give or take. But if you notice, what happens is, for trained individuals, this curve gets pushed to the right. And that shift to the right really gives us another data point. And that data point is this. We know at 4 millimole per liter, which is this line right here, this horizontal line, at 4 millimole, that's when we start to have this onset blood lactate accumulation. And you'll notice what happens if we drop a line down, we end up closer, like 80% in trained individuals. So where I'm going with this is you have people who are untrained who come in to do a workout. The first time you take them through a workout, maybe you're doing like sets of 10. Here we're going to do 1 set of 10 on upright chest press, 1 set of 10 on leg extension, 1 set of 10 on side raise, shoulder press, bicep curls. And I will tell you that you'll have this lactate threshold. And I will also tell you that this OBLA that we see, this onset blood lactate accumulation, the tolerance for that will not be as high for people who are deconditioned. And what happens is, when you get about a month into training a person who was completely deconditioned when they first came in, you can look back to that original workout that you did, and what you'll find is they are able to actually perform that workout very easily, and it becomes more of a warm-up than a workout for them, because they have taught their bodies how to process lactate. They have taught their bodies how to actually recover faster. There's a whole different things. But when you start training for athletics, you have to be able to take your athletes and push them into the zone to be able to basically tolerate the discomfort. But also what happens is, when they're better trained, you have the things that happen like in the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. You have the ability for the hemoglobin to carry more oxygen. You have a greater affinity for the oxygen, like we talked about before. And so the further that curve shifts out to the right before it becomes a hockey stick and goes up, goes vertical, the better. And with highly trained athletes, that OBLA won't happen until much further. Much, much further out. So in general, though, when you're working with your general population in fitness, usually that threshold, right, is right around 80%. And you can do a talking test, and I'll just kind of share this with you as a sidebar. In that talking test, if you can have a conversation with your client, they're probably not over 80%. they're probably not really going through this process of accumulating or having onset blood lactate accumulation happen. And what ends up happening is they can hold a conversation or they can have oxygen for their muscles. And if they can hold a conversation with you, they're probably not over anaerobic threshold. So with that, guys, just remember when you look at this chart, you're talking about lactate threshold, onset blood, lactate accumulation, and the fitter the person, that curve shifts over to the right. All right, signing off.